Excellent. Continuing our series, Christin, how are you?
I'm good, surviving the coronavirus, but I am a little antsy now. So yeah, how are you?
I'm feeling the same thing. I'm sure everyone else is as well.
Yes.
So today, Article 3. I think this is the shortest one of the three. I think we could just blow through probably the specifics of the article and then talk about the fun stuff. Kind of how the framers intended Article 3 and the kind of the judiciary in general. And then some, I think, what I would consider the fatal flaws of Article 3. So let me just pull that up here. So, yeah, I mean, the beginning of it, the opening clause is it creates this idea of a judicial vesting power. There is the judicial power separate from the executive and from the legislative.
Right.
Next phrase, they kind of, well, this is all in Section 1. So then they create the Supreme Court is created. Inferior courts are created, but are given to Congress to create, actually. Not only the courts, but also the scope of those courts.
Right.
The idea of the standard of good behavior for judges, as they are appointed for lifetime positions, as opposed to the other positions that have 2-year terms, 6-year terms, or 4-year terms. And judicial compensation. So this constitutes primarily the makeup of the judiciary itself.
Yeah.
Everything's
And I
pretty.
think people.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think people need to kind of realize that the courts don't exist unless Congress chooses they exist. So aside from the Supreme Court, which is constitutionally mandated, the rest of the courts are completely up to the will of Congress. And I think a lot of people sort of don't realize that. So they see the judicial branch as this massive kind of web of power all across the United States, but it's really only there at the behest of Congress. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think historically speaking, they did abolish all the courts, all the inferior courts at one point in time, early in American history.
I do not actually know that, so that's fascinating. I'll have to go look that up.
Yeah,
I'm not surprised, though. That's the kind of beauty that Congress, the power that Congress has. They can abolish them if they want. Just because they have the power to create, they also have the power to eliminate.
Yeah, and it's also an interesting note that, not only do they get to, as we kind of said earlier, they create the courts, and they also can create the scope of what they can see and what they can even adjudicate. So
exactly.
Things like...
And that goes to the Supreme Court as well.
Absolutely. And it's just so interesting how now we kind of look to them as these arbiters, these supreme beings of intelligence and intellect, and
right.
they're so smart, and it's like, well, I mean, even if they are that, they don't get to decide anything beyond what Congress lets them see, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
The only other thing I would add is, this idea of the good behavior. A lot of people think that this just means that, judges can only be removed from office if, they commit some kind of crime or something like that. And having kind of gone through, especially in the last 5 days, really gone through the Federalist Papers and what their thoughts were on this, on the judiciary, it's quite clear that the standard of good behavior also meant that if they had poor decisions, if they violated anything outside of their scope, as we'll kind of talk about in Section 2, any decisions or appeals or any conduct that or any exercise of their authority that was outside of that scope in Section 2 was considered a violation of that, and they could be impeached for that.
Interesting.
So, in other words, a bad decision would be grounds for impeachment.
For impeachment. Interesting. I did not know that. I did not spend the past couple of days reading through all the Federalist Papers, so that's
It's been a project. It's been something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm finally, when quarantine, I've been motivated to do it. But I gotta say, it is, and this is coming from someone who enjoys this stuff. It is such a grueling process. It is, it's tough.
I know, I've read a lot of them, and it is. I mean, well, I like it a lot. It is taxing on your brain because they definitely are not writing in the type of words and language we're used to,
Yeah, definitely. Let's see, judicial compensation. I would say there's nothing really controversial about that. It kind of mimics the other compensation clauses, particularly that of the president, at least in the way that they can't diminish it while they're in office. And I think that's for obvious reasons. So I'm not, no strong objections there. Um, Going over to section 2, unless you have anything to add to section 1.
Nope. I have a lot of other things I can say on the theory side, but I'm waiting till we get through
Okay,
some of these nuts and bolts.
perfect. So section 2 basically kind of how do I word this? It kind of gives you the scope of the judicial branch, in my opinion. It gives you basically 9 fields, all federally related, that the Supreme Court can pretty much, well, that they have their jurisdiction over. It does have, at the end, Clause 11, the original jurisdiction clause. And these are the things this is the cases that the court is going to see no matter what. You know, it's something that the Constitution grants to them that Congress isn't going to regulate. It goes on to talk about appellate jurisdiction, which again is something that's dictated by the Congress. And so, I mean, just nothing too crazy there either.
And the original jurisdiction is something that plays a big role in Marbury versus Madison, which we can talk about in a little bit.
Yes. Section 3 actually just kind of deals with treason, and I guess this is most relevant today because of the recent Trump impeachment, basically, where it defines the standards for treason and it defines the punishment for treason. And what's interesting about that is that when you look at the impeachment of Trump, and I don't know if we've said this in the past, but you know, the standard for impeachment is quite clear in the Constitution. And if you don't, you know, and although it's kind of one of those messy things where there are standards for impeachment, but also impeachment is with Congress solely. So there's no check or balance there, really. So they can exercise it almost at will.
Exclusive power.
So it's kind of interesting there. And so really, I mean, that's basically Article 3. It's the smallest of the 3. And
it's so simple.
It's not a lot to say about it, but there's more to say about it, kind of how the framers viewed it, and then kind of how it turned out later in the years of the Republic. For me, when I look at this as a whole, actually, you know what? Maybe I'll open it up to you, and I know you're dying to get in here. Give me some of the general principles of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I also want to hear what you're going to say, but I mean, on a very basic level, they just really didn't think of the judicial branch as much of a threat for power at all. So, like, the judicial branch, I think Hamilton specifically said, like, it's the least dangerous branch. So they definitely did not foresee it being what it is today by any means. And I think, generally speaking, the judicial branch, because I remember going over what the Constitution says, and I was like, there's just really nothing here. Like, what is this branch, you know? And like, from what I have been doing research, and I'd like to hear what you kind of have found. But basically, it existed to sort of deal with any sort of major conflicts between states, or, you know, one of the examples I read in the textbook I actually teach from, and it's a reputable textbook, not one of the super liberal biased ones, was saying that, like, you know, if I drop a cinder block on your foot and you say that it was my fault and I say it was your fault or whatever, the judicial branch is there to help figure that type of situation out. And that was literally kind of what the founders felt the judicial branch was going to be there for. That was about it. So, like, they were not makers of law or interpreters of law. They basically just took the law as it was and they applied it. So that was basically it. That was the judicial branch. And it's funny because if you look at the theorists in the past, so Montesquieu did believe that the judicial branch should be separate from the other two branches. But Locke didn't. So John Locke was actually, he did not think that there was any need to have any sort of extra branch beyond the branch that makes the law and the branch that enforces the law. So it's kind of an interesting thing that the founders decided to sort of go with Montesquieu's perspective there, because if you really think, why else if you have a branch that enforces it and a branch that writes it, it does kind of seem natural that then the third branch is the one that interprets it, which is what we now consider the judicial branch to be, for a flawed reason, of course. But that's just one of those, like, really interesting sort of I don't fully know that they fully knew what the judicial branch was there for, but they bought into Montesquieu's reasoning, and they sort of were like, yeah, let's have a judicial branch.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with all of that. I kind of looked at it a little bit more deeply, kind of just having gone through the Federalist Papers and really tried to figure out what were they thinking when they were creating this branch. I came up with a couple of points that we can kind of discuss as we go through them.
Let me hear.
I found that this was the branch of objectivity. This wasn't supposed to be a political branch like the other two.
Right. Yes.
They found that judges were, well, this actually is the source origin really of originalism. Judges were supposed to be bound to originalism as the only legitimate constitutional interpretation, like as a standard.
Right.
As you already said, that Hamilton points out that it's supposed to be the weakest branch. It only has the power of judgment, and note also that this is there's a difference between interpretation and judgment. Whereas interpretation kind of gives you this, well, I can kind of make it go one way or another way. Judgment is more of, well, I have to use my interpretive abilities to determine the truth about what the matter is. And in one case you're making a law essentially, and the other one you're applying existing law. Exactly. Yeah. And so it's really like we've kind of unfortunately have got into this idea that the judges are supposed to interpret laws when it's like, no, they're supposed to be judges of law.
Right.
And that's a totally different mindset.
This whole idea of judicial activism.
Yes, as opposed to originalism.
Right.
And going back to the idea that it's weakest branch, the legislative branch can decide their own jurisdiction. They can remove people from the bench. And evidently, they were quite clear that a president can ignore their decisions, which is, to me, it's I don't know how it all applies, but we'll kind of go through the list and we'll kind of get back to that one.
There's so much there.
Yeah. There's so much.
I wrote a paper in grad school about that topic, so somewhat along the lines of that topic.
Yeah, and I think it's that really right there is one of the reasons that I think this is one of the fatal flaws of the Constitution in the founders' reasoning. But we'll get back to that because I kind of go through it in the next segment. The standards for judges. This is another interesting thing: is that Hamilton generally believed, the framers generally believed that the people that would be considered for judges would be like these exceptional people. He notes that they have to have this special character. They have to have like the correct intelligence. Like they have to be these people who can just kind of just read and remember things and just have this great knowledge and this great respect. And it's so counter to how they viewed every other kind of political person or person in government. How, we're all kind of, we have this potential for evil and good, and people in government are usually bad. And so we want to make sure that we have these systems of checks and balances. But then you get to the judiciary and they're just like, oh, no. Now when we get to this objective branch, these angels, literally, these angels are going to appear before us, and then we'll nominate them to the Supreme Court and everything will be fine. And it's just like, it's just such a...
I think they saw a little, in a flawed way, that them not being connected to the people because of the lack, obviously judges, at least for the most part. I know in some states they are elected, but generally speaking, they're not elected. So they're not going to be, swayed by the emotional or rational winds of the public. Mm-hmm. So I think that was somewhat a part of their flawed reasoning, and that they thought, okay, well, since they're not connected in that way, they're going to be these sort of like disconnected, wise, pure. They're not going to be tainted by what the people want. They can see the law from this, distant perspective. But
yeah, absolutely.
That's not really true.
Well, yeah, it's. I think it's probably the loftiest in their thinking that they get to. I mean, it's just such a contrast when you read about what they thought of politicians and the two political branches, right. And then you get to the judiciary and everything is reversed, and to me that's like, wow, how could you assume that this would be the case? And it's quite literally the case that they made, which is really incredible for guys who I have so much respect for and who really did understand human nature to I think to the proper degree, but for some reason thought that we could somehow achieve this modicum of objectivity.
Right. In that. But what's really interesting is like, I feel for them because they were 30s, 20s and 30s when they wrote these things. So, like they're building like this massive country, and it's like they're bound to have gotten some things a little wrong. But for being 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds creating an entire nation in a way that no other nation had ever been built, I'm like, all right, I'll give you a pass for some flawed interpretation of how the judicial branch. I'm 30 and I could never have figured out how to build an entire country.
I'm with you there. Yeah, it is. It's just, it is interesting that wow, they were that young too. 30. Wow.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. It was funny because like I remember asking my classes like, what do you know of the founding fathers, or what do you think? And they're like, they were just these old guys or something. And I was like, just so you guys know, all of the founding fathers were pretty much in their 20s and 30s at the founding of the country. Like Hamilton was 29 to 30 when he wrote the Federalist Papers. Madison was, I think, 6 or 7 years older than him, so he's 35, 36. But still, I mean, like, and during the Revolutionary War, Hamilton was, 20s, 22, 23. So, like, these guys were building the country, and they were younger than us.
Wow.
Like,
so for all
these are not old. Yeah.
I was going to say, for all the people who don't like the founders, the new correct term is young white men, not old white men.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not old white men. It was young white men.
That's so funny.
Yeah. It's just, I think it kind of puts things in perspective a little bit for people when they realize that these were not these like old guys that have been sitting around at the table all day. These are like young guys that were fighting in a war for freedom, for something they really believed in. And then they had to figure out, well, now that we've won, what do we do?
Yeah, wow, definitely. And, it goes to their character and their intelligence being that young. And like, I mean, what were you doing for the last 30 years? These guys were probably studying and researching and improving their skills and,
right.
I mean,
fighting.
I mean, yeah, and most of them, some of them had some substantial wealth to their name too. So it's like, these guys were hard workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
And I mean, some of them were not even like, I mean, Hamilton was an immigrant. I guess we're all immigrants in the United States. But in other words, he wasn't even like born in the United States. He was brought over here. And, he still really, really, really worked his way up and made his way in the world. And I'm sure all the fans of the Broadway show Hamilton will know that. So.
Wow, it's so funny. For us condemning the founders for what we consider to be their worst article, there's a lot of praise in this episode so far.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess kind of going back to that, I guess where did I leave off at? Oh, so we kind of touch on this idea, but it's slightly different. This idea that somehow they thought that the political branches would be incentivized to preserve the integrity of this branch, given that basically when the president, to create federal judgeships, the president needs to nominate someone, needs to be confirmed by the Senate, and then the commission process after that, as we discovered in the last episode. So it's just so strange that they thought this is how, or this could even happen, that this wouldn't kind of compromise, this objectivity of the branch. And I think all these things kind of lead me to be very critical of them, obviously. But I want to make clear the difference between a flaw due to a lack of adherence to the Constitution, in which case we see this in like examples of the legislative, for example. How if they start legislating things, let's say healthcare, the environment, things of that nature, that's obviously outside of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, that's pretty simple to understand. That's not a fault by them. That's a fault on us for not holding people accountable. But in my opinion, there are actually pretty deep flaws in their actual ideas of their creation of this branch, as we've kind of already discussed.
So being unconstitutional.
Yeah. So I think basically the difference is that like there's a difference between like an idea that has inherent flaws in it and an idea that's good that just isn't being applied. They shouldn't be really treated the same way, basically. And so for this list, I have kind of the fatal flaws of everything, which kind of we've been kind of talking about going back and forth. These judicial decisions, basically, now that they've assumed this power to interpret the Constitution, it's basically given them the power to almost rewrite laws in a lot of ways. They can only not only can they create new laws, but they can also veto laws essentially. And that's really interesting because they actually considered at the convention giving the judicial branch a veto power over legislation. That was unanimously rejected because they wanted that branch to be objective and they didn't want it to be involved in that political process. They thought it would be compromising. But what's interesting about that is that they rejected the idea of a legislative veto, but agreed that non-constitutional laws should be struck down by the court. But the obvious question is, what does that look like in practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much there. So the thing with the courts is that so yes, if it's not constitutional, you're saying they believe the court should strike it down.
Yes. Yep.
I just want to make sure I heard you correctly.
Yep. They argued that non-constitutional laws should be struck down by the courts, and that was one of their proper functions. But then at the same time, how can you say that? I mean, isn't that effectively a judicial veto over legislations?
Right, and then that's also not specifically listed in the Constitution, so that would have to be an understanding of if. In other words, they didn't say that was a power of the courts. It was not listed specifically in the jurisdiction, right?
Yeah, so, that's not in the Constitution, but that's how Hamilton explains it.
Yes, Hamilton, I know Hamilton. So that's the thing, like, I don't know that there was a complete agreement on that, but there was this sort of, as I was studying this to teach it, it was like there's this sort of potential expectation that might end up happening, even if they aren't too keen on the idea that it will. Does that make sense? So it was like some of the founders, maybe not Hamilton. Hamilton was a little more extreme than some of his colleagues. But it was like, okay, we sort of expect that the courts will end up doing this, even though we don't really want to explicitly say that it's within their power to do that, to essentially declare something unconstitutional, which is also interpreting law. And then, of course, the case of Marbury versus Madison is what ended up firmly establishing that position for the court. So I don't know what you have next in your list, but I can go on a little tangent if you want me to.
Go, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to go into the whole Marbury versus Madison story because I think that's just too much. That's a lot. There's a whole lot there, and I think if people want to study that, they can read my blog post if they want. There's a lot. There's a lot there.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But essentially, the court ended up declaring a law that Congress wrote, giving the courts more power, unconstitutional because the Supreme Court didn't have the power to do whatever Congress said they could do. That's what happened in Marbury versus Madison in a very, very quick summary. But in doing so the irony is, in saying that the courts had less power than what Congress gave them, they actually gave themselves a much bigger power, which was the ability to invalidate a congressional law, right? Because up until Marbury versus Madison, that did not happen. And then as we move forward, they start invalidating not only congressional law, but state law. And that gets into this whole other thing, which is selective incorporation and just all this stuff, which I don't think we're getting into today. But what I did want to say, which is really interesting and going along with what you were saying about this whole idea that ambition counteracts ambition, men are selfish and all of this stuff, so we need to have checks and balances, and yet they sort of saw the court as this kind of, aloof, disconnected arbiter of the law that doesn't necessarily is not going to be maybe as driven by those whims and passions as their other two branches. And yet, at the same time, they did want to make sure that this sort of checks and balances stuff was happening, right? So the assumption is that when one branch starts getting too powerful, the other two branches are going to sort of push back because that power from that other branch is threatening their own power, right? So there's this sort of constant push and shove. And so that's what's so interesting about the continued growth of the judicial branch, because the judicial branch has grown exponentially, I would say almost more than the other two branches potentially combined. And it's fascinating because the other two branches haven't tried to stop the judicial branch's growth. And according to the founders' theory, that should have or would have happened, right? Because as the one branch grows, it threatens the potential power of the other two branches. But if you look at it, the funny part about that is that as the judicial branch has grown and grown and grown and gotten more power and more ability to strike down congressional law or to interpret different types of congressional law or different types of the Constitution, what we see is that the judicial branch is only enlarging the power of the executive and the power of the legislative, which then incentivizes the other two branches to do anything but counteract the judicial branch's growth and power, because essentially the more the judicial branch's growth and power grows and the more ability they have to essentially embody the Constitution rather than just even interpret it, the more those other two branches' powers have grown. Does that make sense? So it's this
they all grow together, basically.
Really counterintuitive thing, because the judicial branch has actually been the reason that Congress now has the breadth of power that it has, because the judicial branch has interpreted phrases like the Commerce Clause or others that we've talked about to mean far more than what we would obviously say the founders meant for it to mean. And we've seen that same thing interpreted in things like the Sole Organ Doctrine and other areas of the Constitution to give the executive branch an immense amount of power. So as the court has grown in their power and their ability to essentially state that this is what the Constitution is saying, essentially becoming the Constitution in and of themselves, they've granted immense amounts of power to the other two branches, therefore eliminating the need for those two branches to try to counteract the judicial branch's growth in power. So it's this really sort of tangled web of power. And it's not going to, I do not see the other two branches ever trying to push back against the judicial branch, because the judicial branch is just shoving out power to them left and right. Now, if the judicial branch was constantly squelching their power and getting bigger and bigger, you can believe those two branches are going to fight back because they want their power, right? But that's not what's happened. And I just think that's a really fascinating aspect of the judicial branch, is that it is the one branch that as it grows bigger and bigger, it just enables the other two branches to grow bigger and bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's said in other words, everyone grows together. The judicial branch, I think, remains on top because everyone looks to it as kind of the final arbiter, the final say on whatever's going on. And then keeping itself on top, but also, Congress, do whatever you want with commerce. President, do whatever you want, unless I don't like you. If you're Trump, then no, you can't do anything, even if it's under basic federal law. You can't do it, whether it's with immigration, or injunctions and all this crazy stuff. It's just, it's beyond. Look at the results of this stuff. I think in a lot of ways, as a result of some of these fatal flaws, including the idea of ambition versus objectivity, the idea of political branches making kind of objective decisions for nominating and confirming judges, the idea that judges themselves could even be fully objective to really execute this job.
Right.
All these flaws, I think, kind of have resulted in a lot of, I guess, chaotic decisions. And
and it's a bench of kings, basically, at this point.
And actually, I was just going to say, if there's a prohibition on titles of nobility and kind of an aristocracy in America, but I think if you want to look and if you want to find a true ruling class in America, look no further than the Supreme Court.
100%, yeah. And the Supreme Court, and that's the whole thing, because it was not that powerful, the average length of time that a Supreme Court justice served on the bench in the early days was 9 years, because it wasn't powerful. So it wasn't this highly sought after position. And then it really wasn't very long until it jumped to 20 years by, I think, Andrew Jackson era. And then, moving on from there, it just kept increasing and increasing. And the reason for that is because the Supreme Court's power kept increasing. And so, of course, once you got that power, you're not going to want to give that up. And so then that's why all of the appointments to the Supreme Court have become more and more controversial, is because the gravity of that appointment has increased. And not just the Supreme Court anymore. You go to most court appointments now have become that much more important. And court appointments that used to be nothing are even starting to become controversial. So it's just fascinating because you see the evidence of the growth in power simply by looking at things like how quickly court appointments happen. And the less quickly they happen, the more that's an indication of the growth in power because of the importance of the position that's being appointed, right? The effect that it can have. It's just, it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the term limit or the terms people would serve. Even in Congress during that time, most people in the beginning would only serve 1, maybe 2 terms, and just they would leave because they didn't view it as like a job per se. They viewed it as a service to the country. So in their minds, it's like, I'll do this for a few years, and then I'll go back to the private sector and do whatever I was doing.
Right, and most of them didn't live there, and most of the governing happened at the state level. So, you know.
All great stuff there. The other issue, probably the biggest issue, as a result of all this kind of judicial legislating, is that, and I know you can attest to this because it drives me nuts. How often do you find yourself online, you're discussing things with people, and you'll be like, where does it say, where does it authorize in the Constitution to do this, act that Congress wants to do? And they go, oh, well, the Supreme Court said. And then you just go, no, that's not. They've, basically, it's this idea between actual constitutional law and court-created constitutional law. Mm-hmm. That nothing drives me more insane than that, because the idea, and then it's created this web of court decisions where now we're not even looking at the Constitution anymore. We're looking at decisions over the course of 200 years, trying to justify whatever our own opinion is.
Right.
In a lot of ways. And even I gotta say, even justices I like if you read majority opinions for like the DC versus Heller, I mean, even he's kind of bouncing around from decisions and kind of I don't know, he just approaches the defense of the Second Amendment in a way that I wouldn't. Because they're so bound by this idea that you have to ground what you say in what someone else said in the past. When someone could have been super wrong. Yeah, precedent, basically. And someone could have been super wrong about that. And it doesn't make sense, the idea that a majority opinion is supposed to have greater weight than all the authority as opposed to a dissent. And yet, even dissents are used to create majorities in the future, majority decisions.
Yes.
And it's there's no rules with this stuff. There's no way to even understand it.
It's very arbitrary.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is exactly what exactly what the theorists and founders wanted to avoid. It's there's something I was going to say that I don't want to lose my thought with it. Okay, so it's just one of these things where I always tell my students, I'm like, the court's power is solely set upon or contingent upon us, the people, in other words. So, and I remember in grad school, a huge concept that everyone talked about as relates to courts is the concept of legitimacy. Because if the courts are considered or ever deemed illegitimate by the people, the courts lose all power. And so their whole goal is to stay and maintain this sort of kingship almost persona that we were just discussing. Because if you look at even just the public opinion polls of the different branches of government, Supreme Court consistently gets the highest, approval ratings. Obviously, Congress usually gets one of the lowest, and then the president might be somewhere in the middle. But the Supreme Court, people like the Supreme Court. People respect the Supreme Court to the point that when the Supreme Court does say something, it's always well, we need to get it to the Supreme Court. Maybe the most recent thing was this whole situation with the gay marriage situation. So, it's not settled until we get the Supreme Court say. And once the Supreme Court say happens, you notice that the zeitgeist in the country, the zeitgeist being just the overall sort of feeling in the country, just shifts and we move on from that topic.
Yep,
right? So prior to, I don't even know how to pronounce the name, Roger B. Fell or whatever, that was the Supreme Court case on the gay marriage situation. Prior to that whole thing was just raging, and it was just everyone was talking about, the gay marriage rights and all this stuff. Well, we had that Supreme Court case, and guess what? That topic is not really that big of a deal anymore. It's sort of a settled, done issue, which it sort of speaks to this broader power that the Supreme Court holds over the actual social sort of moral positions of America in general, not just this and I wrote a paper on this. This is fascinating to me, but they sort of shift and they move the actual norms of the country based on what they say. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
And a
right.
lot of that is contingent upon the fact that we deem them that way. And so I challenge my students. I'm like, all right, I want you guys to think about if the Supreme Court does, quote unquote, interpret or reinterpret, essentially make a law, right? So when they reinterpret laws or they say what the Constitution says, they're making law. Well, the executive branch was created to implement laws for who? For Congress, because Congress is the lawmaking branch. So the executive branch is the executive arm of Congress. It is not the executive arm of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court was never meant to make law. So it can't, you know what I'm saying? There's no executive attachment to it.
Exactly.
So when the Supreme Court, quote unquote, makes a law, are those 9 old people going to go out and make every single person follow that? Right?
No, I mean, they depend exclusively on the executive to execute any decision that they might make.
Exactly. Not just the executive, but the state governments as well,
No,
and
absolutely.
Congress to a degree.
Mhm.
And this is where we come into play, because what if we didn't like what the Supreme Court said?
Yeah, I mean, these are big questions. I mean,
You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
Who is the executive and Congress going to upset their constituency? There's and I know, and I wrote a whole paper on this whole implementation aspect of things. There have been cases, and I can't remember them off the top of my head right now, where the executive has refused because it's not a popular thing, and so if we're not happy, if we're not on board, guess what? The Supreme Court's ruling has no power and has no legitimacy whatsoever. And that's what's fascinating about it. And so they're always struggling to try to keep that legitimacy, because they know that if they are not deemed that way, and if their rulings are not considered legitimate, then the executive and the legislative and the state, they're not going to do it. They don't care. They want to make sure their citizens are happy, because their citizens are who keep them in office and keep them having a job, not the Supreme Court, right?
Mhm.
But if we're all on board with the Supreme Court and we're just like, oh, well, the Supreme Court said it, so that's it, then of course the other branches are going to feel the pressure from the people. So that's where it just always comes back down to how educated is the citizenry, because the buck stops with us,
Mhm.
our government's functioning. It really stops with us, because the other branches are always going to rely upon what we want, as much as we are willing to fight for that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're talking about the prestige of the court, the first thing that came to my mind was that they've kept all the prestige, and you can see that in the polls that people like the court, but they haven't kept any of the standards required to earn or maintain that status of prestige. They haven't been objective. They've abandoned originalism in favor of activism, meaning
Right.
they're just trying to pursue their own personal policy preferences.
Mhm.
And it's just how you reverse that's a big question. And you kind of bring up ignoring it at certain levels. And I struggle with this a lot, because I've been thinking about how I would have corrected this, and it really is a difficult task. I see why the framers might have been silent on it, because it's a really hard thing to think about. But I do wonder, if you were just to ignore court decisions, I mean, you might as well not even have courts then. I mean, what's the point? If decisions can be ignored, why not just have some section of the legislative branch, determine kind of, we pass a law. This is what we meant when we passed the law. So I don't know, use this. And then if there's a dispute, I don't know how you'd resolve it. But you see what I mean? There's kind of these, it's really hard to answer, what that looks like in practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it works both. It'll work both ways.
It does. It works both ways. But if you just think, if you think, not that this is necessarily a good thing, but back during, what was it, the 60s, 70s, Brown versus Board of Education, I can't remember when that was passed. But that was essentially sort of reaffirming the Civil Rights Act, and this whole idea that there should be desegregation in schools, right? And so that was a Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. I can't remember the little girl's name, but it was somebody Brown. And she obviously wanted to go to the school, and then blah, blah. And that was a class action suit. So it was basically, whenever they ruled in favor of her, they were ruling in favor of every single person that was in the same boat as her. essentially, of course, desegregating all schools. And if you notice, the states didn't do that. Like, the majority of southern states refused, just literally flat out refused, to implement what the Supreme Court said. And so that was a clear case of refusal to do something that the courts said they should do. And so obviously, I do not think that was the best, best situation, but that's a clear example, in other words, of just choosing to refuse to do it, because that was almost completely favored universally in those states at that time. So there was no pushback from people who did. So it was just, let's say the Supreme Court today decided to abolish all gun rights. I mean, do you really believe that the state governments are going to sit there and capitulate, right? Because they know that in general, all of us are sure not going to go with that, right? And so there's this sort of like, yes, I understand all these these little nitpicky issues. It's probably harder to figure out how do we actually personally, deal with that. But if you kind of think about it on the broad scale, if we were to all be that vigilant, we could react in the same way that they reacted back with the Brown versus Board of Education. So if we decided, well, we don't really think that such and such case has any merit, and so if that was a strong opinion in every single state, sorry, those states are not going to do it. And yes, I mean, it's true. And then of course you've got to deal with, okay, is the executive going to try to force the states to do it like they did with Brown versus Board, where he sent the National Guard in and stuff? Or is the executive maybe quite aware and okay with the fact that people are not willing to do it? It's a really interesting question. My whole paper was on that. Just like, how does that work? Yeah.
I like the, I like the idea because it is grounded in kind of like state sovereignty, and, there's a lot of history and a lot of legitimate history behind that. You're reminding me of an amendment that Mark Levin had in his book, The Liberty Amendments, where he suggested one of the ways to get past a judicial tyranny and bad decisions is to have I can't remember if it was a popular vote or something. It was some kind of vote to basically overturn bad court decisions. So any Supreme Court decision could be overturned, 3 years, I think, after its decision. So if you can mobilize the country, and it's probably by some kind of state by state basis. If you can mobilize the country, they could, you could overturn a court decision.
I mean, you could do that already, basically. So, you just pass a constitutional amendment, and at that point, what's the court going to do? Say that the constitutional amendment is unconstitutional, which you can't, because it's the Constitution. So there are methods, and the constitutional amendment is, I think, a really good way, because you've got the combination of Congress with the state government sort of working together. I think popular vote is pretty dangerous, because you could see that the whims of the people in any given moment could cause some major problems. But
I can't remember. I want to say, I think it was more like state legislatures. If state legislatures voted and a certain majority of the states agreed that the decision should be abolished, then it would get abolished and it wouldn't apply.
Oh, okay. Which is similar to a constitutional amendment, just maybe without the addition of Congress or something like that.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't as detailed as like the Article 5 process, because that's that's the point of that book, is to use that process to give the states new powers to overturn I think it was congressional legislation, judicial decisions, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I liked that idea a lot of just kind of, because the idea of checks and balances is kind of dead when it comes to Article 3, and I think that for every action, you need some kind of recourse in case that action is abused, and and that's one of the things the court's lacking. And so, what I liked about that idea is that at least you have, recourse, some kind of recourse from bad decisions. Yes, one of the ideas I was playing with was an idea of you still have a court, but for every law that is passed, what goes with it is kind of like a pamphlet or something that kind of explains the intent of the law, the proper application of the law, kind of giving like a written document. So like not only can judges look at that and know like, hey, this is how I'm supposed to interpret this law, but also for citizens so that they know how the law is going to apply, and so how they can find themselves, not in courtrooms. And I liked that idea a lot too, but I don't know, I want to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think any recourse is going to be better than no recourse. So, the way and the method that it actually works and that it actually happens, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think that could work. It potentially could work. I'm sort of more in the mindset of states. I like the idea of states rather than just individuals.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that doesn't hurt for people to know. But I just don't think that. I think ultimately the power should more go to the states. So maybe it's the state governments that get that document and then sort of disperse it with their citizenry or something like that. But then again, I'm pretty classic with my understanding of federalism, as you and I have discussed. So.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, awesome. Well, I think we've pretty much figured out. Oh, wait, I have some honorable mentions for Article 3. Also, Article 3, Section 3, Clause... Oh, no, sorry, Article 1. I apologize. Regarding the Trump impeachment, there was a recent attempt of grab power by the courts. And not really, I shouldn't even say by the courts. It was by the mainstream media. They were trying to suggest to us that Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 gave the Chief Justice all this power over the trial over impeachment trials. They said that, he has this power via the shall preside clause of the Constitution. You probably saw a couple New York Times pieces on that, or whatever it was, Newsweek or something, where they were trying to make another power grab by giving more power to, based on nothing, based on just like shall preside. And they were like, that means that the Chief Justice can basically do whatever he wants. He can command and control the whole impeachment process in the Senate. And no, the Senate has the sole power. It's so crazy, these people.
It is, yeah. I don't understand the demand for power, and yet then the absolute horror of power. It's just like this whole situation with the coronavirus. It's like everyone is mad that Trump would be able to tell us to reopen or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then, at the same time, they're like, but why isn't he telling us all to close? Why isn't he doing more? Which is like, it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. Like, you're demanding that he not use his power in one instance and saying that he shouldn't, and yet the other saying that he's using too much. It's all just, And so the same applies to that situation where it's just, it doesn't really make sense.
Yep. Well, awesome.
Maybe we have a tendency to images, personas that are like royalty or something. I don't know. There's probably some psychological study on that somewhere.
Well, I mean, I forgot who said it, but I think it might have been one of the framers, because I've just been reading them so much lately, that man is a creature that obeys a creature of ambition, or something of that nature.
Interesting. Yeah.
Like that, a lot of us do look to, and I mean, it's kind of in us. Like, if you believe in God, then, you would suggest that, well, we're trying to seek some, greater being beyond us to be kind of like a follower, for a lack of a better word. And,
that's true.
That kind of also applies not only spiritually, but kind of like in the physical world with there's a bigger, stronger person other people admire. I better admire him too.
Right.
Something like that.
That's true.
Well, awesome. I think that's a good place to stop. It's a little shorter, but I think that's appropriate for the article. The only other honorable mention I would have is that, we talked about this idea that the court is not this, they're not gods, basically. And the beginning chapter of Mark Levin's book, Men in Black, really, I think, solidified that for me, where he goes over quite literally the imperfections and the imperfections of certain justices over the course of the last couple hundred years, and it's quite shocking. A lot of these guys were literally insane. Some were drunks and alcoholics. I mean, these guys were just regular human beings. Really, they're not. They weren't these supreme leaders with super insight into things. No, they were just regular guys who got nominated and confirmed. Not a big deal.
Right.
So I would definitely check that out if you want to look at that.
Young guys at that.
Yes. All right, well, Christin, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you.